Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. Good afternoon to all. Colleagues, representatives of the national parliaments present, members of the European Parliament, I am very glad to be able to speak to you today, along with President Rodriguez of the Assembleia of the Republic, and along with the main speakers which have accepted to participate in this session, this plenary session, opening session of the new edition of the European Parliament Week. We share the hope and vision on a number of different topics, and more specifically what we want to focus on today. The circumstances of the organization of this event are particular today. Today the world confronts the virus. It is being tested. The values of the continent are being tested. And all of those different structures that existed for cooperation, international cooperation after the Second World War to promote liberty, prosperity, and peace are being tested. So we do have a challenge before us, and it creates a very, very special situation, a need for international cooperation of unprecedented proportions following the Second World War. Together we have to confront the problems, the transnational problems that cannot be confronted alone. Today, more than ever, we need multilateralism, we need Europe, we need international cooperation. And the political progress, the institutional progress that has existed is, of course, under threat and has been under a threat by populist governments on both sides of the Atlantic. Nonetheless, we move forward. And we have to look at the causes of this pandemic as well. It is the direct result of an economic model which called for exploitation of a rampant and maximalist nature, unbridled as well, which led to massive deforestation, intensive agriculture, urbanization, pollution, impoverization of diversity, and of course the entire world has suffered terribly from this pandemic. In other words, beyond the economic consequences and social consequences, the pandemic has also led to an exacerbation of inequality and thus threatens the cohesion of our European society. Entire sectors of the economy have been decimated. Devastation have collapsed. Many businesses closed forever. The pandemic has struck down the vulnerable individuals in society, the elderly, isolated individuals, children, women, the disabled, and has increased inequality. Inequality was already a serious situation, a serious issue prior to the pandemic. So many member states have been severely hit, particularly young people and women. It has increased inequality at the national level, but at the international level as well. We're not all equal. Not all are equal as far as how the pandemic is dealt with either. We have an economic emergency. We have a social challenge before us. The agreement of the Council of the 21st of July was historic in nature. For the first time in the history of the European Union, we have massive transfers financed by the Union directly to the member states. These financial flows provide for and are essentially in themselves a concrete mechanism of solidarity and indicate the concerted effort. So these resources have to indeed support our economies, particularly the economies that have been struck down in a number of member states, and this is an emergency situation. As soon as possible, we have to establish that particular cutoff point as far as own resources and establish how we're going to move forward for the new generation EU. And it is only after ratification that we'll be able to move forward, and will the markets be rejuvenated, so to say, or will have an injection of those necessary resources that they need. Within the framework of this agreement, there are clear responses to the challenges that have been set before us by the pandemic. It's necessary to, however, look at particular facets. For example, protection of the environment. And indeed, protection of the environment becomes all the clearer now with the pandemic. But not only protection of the environment, protecting cohesion in our Europe as well. The next generation EU will provide for the necessary investments and will transform our productive process into a structure, into, if you like, a tank that will help us to defend ourselves against the various challenges that exist before us. Environmental challenges, climatic challenges, social challenges, the inequality that exists before us, and dealing with poverty, human poverty, impoverishment of the environment as well, and the ecological crisis that exists right now and that we'll have to confront in the future as well. We are unfortunately not all equal. We have to achieve, however, equality. And it's in this context that I feel that it's necessary to use these particular instruments which have been activated and ignited, if you like, initiated by the European Union to fight COVID-19, to fight as well poverty. Reflecting the need to keep the necessary clauses, those safeguard clauses, in place as well, so that all can be used in the most effective fashion. In other words, in the months to come, we have very important decisions to be made as far as how we're to move forward. Otherwise, 25 member states will have to initiate procedures because of excessive deficit. That is to say, if we don't use these new implements, these new tools, financial tools that exist before us, and move forward effectively. So I think indeed we do have to speak very much about these particular issues, about the initiative which has already been ignited by the European Union to fight COVID-19, the pandemic, and its consequences. And we have to understand that it is only through a concerted effort that we'll be able to be effective. Part of that concerted effort is the vaccination campaign. For months, we've been trying to find an effective vaccine that now exists before us. Numerous challenges have existed, and now we move forward with it. Now, in a few months, we will celebrate 5 years since the Paris Agreement for the protection of the environment. 5 years. That means that we have to take stock of what has been done, what the possibilities are for the future, what sort of facilities have been adopted, and what sort of policies have been taken on board by the European Union in order to reach those particular goals set in the Paris agreements, and particularly on the sustainable development front. So I think it's very important to look at these resources, the recuperation of resources, the issue of own resources as well, and how all of this will come together in order to serve generations of the future. What is most important that we work jointly, particularly as far as adoption of measures in order to come back to where we were, recuperate all the time and all that which has been lost. And I do feel that, once again, it is only collectively that we'll be able to achieve that. We need that energy, we need that vitality in order to confront the challenges that exists before us. It's not only to protect individuals, it's to protect our society as a whole. And at this point, I would like to give the floor to President Ferro Rodriguez. Eduardo Ferro Rodriguez, you have the floor, President of the Assembly of the Republic.
E senhores deputados, caro Presidente David Sassoli, caras e caros colegas, é grato.
Dear colleagues, it's a real pleasure to be together with you today, even if it's in a virtual format. I hope that we won't lack opportunities in future to be able to meet each other in Lisbon. The times we're living through are hard. The dark days of the first wave of the pandemic has now been followed by a second wave that was even more deadly, even more devastating than the first. And overcoming it is our priority. Everything is fragile, everything is contingent. We have to look at the macroeconomic indicators and the forecasts that have been made. The economic impact of coronavirus is a cross-cutting, horizontal attack on our economy. It's paralyzed aviation and tourism. Companies are facing serious difficulties, particularly small and medium-sized companies. Workers are being laid off and find themselves unemployed. There are limitations on the four freedoms of the European Union. Facing an unheard of situation, the EU has resolved to react. In April, we saw the initial measures being taken, and then in the summer with the proposals for the MFF and the proposals for the next generation EU. Now, these measures will be decisive in our ability to respond, to recover and reform our economies. However, political agreements are not sufficient in themselves. We're still awaiting the ratification of the Council's own resources decision by many national parliaments. Without that, we don't have access to the financial markets. In Portugal, ratification took place at the end of January. This is a moment for us to think, but also a time to act. We have to look at the conditions of macroeconomic conditionality within the Stability and Growth Pact. We're closely following the debate on the pertinence of the measures. There was a temporary derogation through the General Escape Clause in March 2020, but as President of the Portuguese Assembleia of the Republic, and as someone who's very aware of the effects of these criteria, I would call upon everyone to take this opportunity to review the logic, the structural logic of those conditionality criteria. I think that there's a broad consensus that we should avoid pro-cyclical policies. The World Bank and the European Central Bank have stated this clearly, but there also has to be consensus behind the review of these criteria, which have shown pro-cyclical characteristics in the past, with extremely devastating social impact across many different European countries. We have to continue to work on finalizing banking union and capital market union. On the geopolitical level, Europe is losing its central position. We've got demographic challenges. Youth unemployment is worrying. The education system needs to ensure that young people can get a place on the foothold on the employment market. For that, research and innovation are essential. We have changed our relationship with the planet completely. We're becoming increasingly aware of the need to combat climate change. And we're becoming more and more aware of how important territorial planning is. Words like the circular economy, the carbon economy, the green and digital transition, they're all things that have entered our vocabulary. Of course, these all have to be just. We also need to ensure that there is an ethical framework and that the human being is at the center of our concerns. The pandemic has exposed other realities. It's exposed our dependence on raw materials. I'm afraid we seem to have lost sound. Okay. Now, the Green Deal is going to be a major initiative. I see relocalization as a major opportunity using up-to-date technologies. To be successful in this effort, we have to approach the economic fabric of our societies as a whole. It's the capillary network of small and medium-sized companies that provide our added value. They're part of industrial ecosystems. Giving more power to these small and medium-sized companies will give us extra benefit. It's something that is obvious, but it's worth reaffirming. Industrial policy has to be open, it has to be sustainable and inclusive, and that is the basis of the just transition mechanism. Sustainable development has three pillars: economics, the environment, but also social aspects. Over the decades, inequality has increased. And the concern is that the pandemic will further worsen situations of social exclusion. Turning this direction of travel around is a priority, not just a social necessity, but a democratic demand. Populism and authoritarianism can only live when there is a lack of perspective. The social summit in Porto should provide qualitative and quantitative conclusions so that we can conclude the European Pillar of Social Rights. Colleagues, we hold this meeting in demanding times, and my hope is that we will be able to guide the actions of the European Union through those conclusions on the social pillar. It's our society that is the foundation for our common future. We'll now give the floor to the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. I would like to wish all of the participants in the European Parliamentary Week the best possible chances to take part in our work today.
Honourable members of Parliament.
Austatud parlamendiliikmed, tahaksin tänada Euroopa Parlamenti ning minu enda koduriigi parlamenti.
The partnership between the United Nations and the European Union is strongly rooted in shared values and priorities. This year's European Parliament Week comes as the world continues to face the devastating impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. What started as a global health crisis has triggered economic, social, humanitarian and human rights crises. It has greatly exacerbated inequalities within and among nations. And while the world is facing an existential climate threat, biodiversity loss and pollution, we will not overcome this situation by reverting to the old normal. We have an opportunity to be ambitious. We have an obligation to recover better. We must embrace a sustainable and inclusive pathway. Invest in health systems and social protection, build resilient infrastructure, support education and green jobs, and of course, reduce debt pressure. No country should be forced to choose between helping their populations and servicing their debts. In these efforts, we have a framework to guide us, the Sustainable Development Goals. The European Union's Recovery and Resilience Facility holds great potential, representing the largest stimulus package in the EU's history. Putting the European Green Deal at the heart of this effort is not only the right thing to do, but a smart investment in the future. Support for a global rollout of COVID-19 vaccinations is also a crucial part of the solution. Let's be clear, it is unacceptable that just 10 countries account for 75% of global vaccinations to date. It's not only unfair, it is also dangerous. I'm calling for a global vaccination plan to bring together all those with the required power, scientific expertise, and production and financial capacities, and ensure that everyone has access to the vaccine. Only then can we defeat COVID-19 and rebuild more resilient economies and societies. 2021 must also be the year to build a global coalition for reaching carbon neutrality by the middle of the century. At the same time, we must achieve a breakthrough on adaptation. Donors should commit to increasing the share of climate finance allocated to adaptation from 20% today to 50% in 2024. Developed countries must also fulfill their pledge to mobilize $100 billion annually for climate action in developing countries. All development banks should align their portfolios with the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals by 2024 and help mobilize private finance. I thank the European Union's continued engagement towards these. Meanwhile, geopolitical tensions are on the rise, including in Europe. We must strengthen diplomacy for peace, build trust between institutions and society, and combat discrimination and disinformation. We must adapt to complex situations through a networked, inclusive, and effective multilateralism. As a former member, I know firsthand that parliaments have a key role to play, and EU leadership will be vital. Only by working together with the most vulnerable at the center of our efforts can we truly build a more sustainable, just, and resilient future. I will continue to count on your vision and your support. Thank you.
Obrigado. Tem agora a palavra.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the General Director of the International Monetary Fund, Crystallina Giorgiova. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you today. As EU Commissioner in the past, I benefited greatly from interactions with this conference, and I am honored to join you again. It is a critical time. Jean Monnet once said, "People only act in a state of necessity and usually only recognize necessity in a situation of crisis." We are in a crisis and it is time for action. In 2020, 90% of the countries finished the year with smaller economies, in other words, poorer than at the start of it. The worst performance the world had during peacetime. But it could have been much worse. Exceptionally strong and coordinated actions by central banks and by finance authorities have played a critical role in mitigating the human and the economic impacts. And here I want to pay tribute to Christine Lagarde and the ECB for reacting swiftly with extraordinary policy accommodation, and also to all the governments of the EU for putting in place massive fiscal support of over 3 trillion euros for firms and for households, including job retention schemes that helped over 54 million workers. And the Next Generation EU initiative is a remarkable achievement in joint mobilization of funds. Bravo! These actions, together with unprecedented scientific advances on vaccines and treatment, many of those homegrown in Europe, and progress in applying masks, social distancing, testing, contact tracing, have helped stabilize the economy and move the world and the EU towards recovery. So what do we see in 2021? We are projecting global growth of 5.5% and 4.2% in the EU this year. But let me be clear, the path to recovery is highly uncertain and, most importantly, uneven. Uncertain because of the ongoing race between a mutating virus and the vaccines. Uneven because of the difference in starting positions, economic structure, capacity to respond. causing inequalities to grow both across and within countries. And we heard the speakers before me quite concerned talking about that. And it is my deepest concern that the great lockdown of 2020 could morph into a great divergence in 2021. Divergence is most profound in the developing world, where half of the countries that used to catch up in income levels with their wealthier peers are now falling further behind for a first time in decades. But divergence is a risk for the EU as well. Let me look at some of the obvious examples. Traditional tourist destinations, they have experienced much sharper contractions, more than 9% last year in Spain, Greece, and Italy, compared to an average contraction of 6.4% across the EU. And we project that by the end of 2022, per capita income for the emerging markets of Central and Eastern Europe will be 3.8% below pre-crisis projections, compared to a shortfall of just 1.3% for the EU's advanced economies. This is a negative impact almost 3 times larger that will slow the pace of convergence Europe enjoyed for decades. We also see increasing divergence within countries in the form of worsening inequality. Always happens in pandemic, and it is happening again. Regions with lower GDP per capita went into the crisis with low productivity, larger contact-intensive sectors, fewer jobs that allow for remote working. So, of course, they have been hit all the harder. As we heard before me, when jobs are gone, it is women and young people suffering the most. So the big question facing policymakers everywhere and in the European Union is, how can we ensure a strong recovery and tackle this threat of divergence at the same time? First, and the health crisis. This year, vaccine policy is the most important economic policy in Europe and around the world. And we all know it. Until we defeat the pandemic everywhere, we risk new mutations that threaten our progress. Scaling up production, and I'm stressing this, we need to produce more, and distribution of vaccines is critical. And so too is additional financing to secure doses, to pay for logistics, as well as for timely to take timely reallocations if we have excess supplies, in a timely manner, move it where it is needed. And all of this requires cooperation. It's not going to fall from the sky. Second, fight the economic crisis. Until the pandemic is defeated, support for firms and households should continue. Gradual withdrawal has to follow, not precede, a durable exit from the health crisis. It matters internally within countries. It also matters in terms of spillovers. A premature tightening of policy when worse-hit economies are still deeply fragile could exacerbate divergence between countries. And while now is not the time to withdraw support, it is the time to ascertain the strength of insolvency regimes. We have provided massive support in 2020 that led to lower than average bankruptcies, fewer bankruptcies than in previous years. Once support declines, and with structural change accelerating, the risk of higher rate of debt defaults will go up, and that is why insolvency arrangements, greater emphasis on equity support, is so necessary to help prevent debt overhangs and ratcheting bankruptcies. Third, and most important over the long run, harness response to the crisis to spur structural shifts to digitalization and greening, and power up again Europe's convergence engine. We have done some analysis. It shows that a coordinated green infrastructure investment push is really a must. It could boost GDP over a 15-year period by about 0.7% each year, creating millions of new jobs. Carbon pricing can help repair fiscal balances, channel private investments into green sectors, deliver substantial emission reductions. Increased access to high-speed internet in rural and underserved areas would raise productivity. Education spending, investing in human capital, job training programs would build the skills needed for the economy of the future. And Europe can also step up reforms. I listened very carefully and completely agree with the need to address persistent structural challenges. The new generation EU can be more than a catalyst for economic transformation. It can be a forerunner to new shared fiscal tools to complement the ECB's single monetary policy. And you can take further steps toward banking and capital market union to spur growth, to spur integration. And last but definitely not least, efforts to make international corporate taxation fit for the digital age can boost revenues, and it can help us address inequality. Let me finish with a word of thanks for your support to our work at the IMF during this crisis. From the outset, we swiftly recalibrated our policy advice. Our message, spend, but keep the receipts, was unusual for the fund, but appropriate for this crisis. And we put our money where our mouth is. We provided over 105 billion in new financing to 85 countries. In Europe, those include Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Moldova, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Ukraine. We adjusted our capacity development work to the needs and modalities of work during the pandemic. We strengthened focus on inclusive growth, especially working with you, with our European partners, on issues like progressive taxation and social spending. And very important, we stepped up work on climate change. It is a threat to economic and financial stability, and it is an opportunity for green growth and jobs. We have done an analysis of policies to reach EU's ambitious carbon emission reduction goals. And this analysis is exactly because of our commitment to put climate change at the heart of our work. We are working closely with you to do more for low-income countries. They face painful choices between tackling the health crisis, meeting people's basic needs, fostering macroeconomic stability, boosting public investments. And what I want to say from my heart is that you and all the people of Europe can be proud of your assistance to vulnerable countries during this crisis, as you have done in many crises before. You have backed up all our efforts. You have contributed to our debt relief, to our concessional lending capacity, and you're seeking ways to do more, including through a new SDR allocation to boost reserves without compounding debt burdens. And I greatly appreciate EU finance minister's support in this regard. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Secretary of the United Nations and the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Crystallina Giorgiova, for their contributions to the debate this afternoon. I will now give the floor straight to President David Sassoli. You have the floor.
Grazie, caro Presidente. Diamo la parola.
Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to the President of the European Council, Charles Michel. He's connected with us. There you are. So, President, you have the floor.
È collegato? Sente?
Are you connected properly? Could you hear us?
Prego, Presidente Michel.
President. Michel?
Monsieur le Président Sassoli.
Yes, thank you very much, President Sassoli. There was a slight problem with microphones, but thank you very much, President Sassoli. Thank you, President Ferrer-Rodriguez, for giving me the opportunity to address the conference. The European Parliament and the 27 national parliaments are obviously the beating heart of democratic discourse in the European Union at national level. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share one or two ideas with you when it comes to the future of our European project and to say something about some of the priorities that we feel are important. 2020 and 2021 most probably are going to be very important turning point years for the world and our European project. We have been very hard hit by the pandemic and we're still suffering from the pandemic, and it is testing some of our certitudes and testing basically what we've been used to. And obviously we've also seen a speeding up and acceleration of certain trends which probably existed before the pandemic. I've heard Crystallina Giorgiova referring to some of these aspects. She said that 2020 has also been characterized by our ability to come together, not only our governments but our European countries, together with our partner institutions, i.e. the European Parliament and the Commission, in order to come up with a very ambitious response to the crisis that is hitting us, and also to be able to allow ourselves the necessary financial means also to combat the pandemic, 800 billion euro in order to support social cohesion at the level of the European Union and to do very many other things as well. And I think this commitment shows that institutional democratic commitment is absolutely essential. And I have been a privileged witness of the influence of the European Parliament in their debates, the dynamic nature of the parliamentary debates at the Council. Obviously, they've been very ambitious. I've also seen their support for this concept of own resources, because this is an absolutely essential reform for the future of the European Union. The idea is to invest together once we've taken out loans together. And I think you'll all realise that all of us are very much focusing on and gathered around these two main pillars in the post-COVID period. We're talking about the fight against climate change, and then, of course, there's the digital pillar. These two pillars are extremely important because, as far as I see it, they go to show that it's not just a kind of business-as-usual recovery plan, and it's not a recovery plan as we would have had in the past. What we have now is a veritable project based on a change of paradigm. So we're talking a true paradigm shift, and we're talking about we have a new social model, and the idea is to try and have some kind of impact on, well, what goes on within the European Union, around the world, and also draw on our own strengths. And if I could say something about the digital, the climate aspects, but also make another point and stand back a little and see how the member states and other countries around the world have developed. In reality, if we take a look at prosperity, development and progress that has been achieved over the past years, a lot of this has been based on a rampant exploitation of natural resources with the results we know. And I think there is greater awareness around the world that this rampant exploitation model is not a sustainable model, hence the need for a paradigm shift. And then in parallel, we've also noticed that we have the development of artificial intelligence, digital development, supercomputers. we've realized that the main resource number one in the coming cycle, is the resource linked to the digital sector, big data. And I would like to make the most of the opportunity I have in addressing you to say that when it comes to this particular natural resource, this is what we really have to draw on and use it to stop the old exploitation model. We have to use digital tools and instruments in order to help us to encourage research and development, economic research and development, and social development. And at the same time, we have to make sure that when it comes to our democratic model and context, which is based on fundamental freedoms, the right to privacy, that all of that is respected and guaranteed. Citizens in Europe and around the world are not going to just sit back and accept that the resource of personal data is going to be used in an abusive way, i.e. without respecting this democratic context and fundamental freedoms. And this is why I'd like to say that obviously the European Union is very much committed when it comes to developing and using this natural resource, and also to ensure that we do have the necessary democratic and parliamentary scrutiny of what is actually going on. If I could come back to another point, which is very important as well. Over the coming weeks, the national parliaments, the national governments are going to be drawing up their national recovery plans, the national recovery and resilience plans, and sending them to the Commission of the European Union. And obviously, we have to make this a success story altogether. We have to ensure that every euro is properly invested at the national level so that this does have a beneficial effect on recovery in terms of social cohesion, for example. And we have to ensure that the debates that are going on within the national parliaments, whether it's on the national recovery plans, all of this goes hand in hand, is in line with own resources, and is characterized by democratic vitality, because obviously we want to ensure that the 540 million citizens around the European Union feel properly involved in what's going on. And I'd like to perhaps put out a plea, launch an appeal, given that we have this big meeting of parliamentary representatives at the national level, the European level. And this is a plea for the generation of young people, the so-called COVID generation, those who are 2021, in 2020, 2021. I think all of us have realized that young people have seen their lives turned upside down. And these are young people who only a short time ago were out in the streets protesting about climate change and trying to make all of us aware of what needs to be done. And they're having to do homeschooling, and it's extremely difficult, of course, for them to go and do their training properly in companies, etc. And we're thinking in terms of the climate goals 2050. There are other targets that have been set that we need to meet by 2030. We have the digital agenda. And I think we have to ensure that the digital and climate change transitions are mobilized properly so that they can have a positive impact for our young people. In a few months' time, we have a very important meeting in Lisbon with the entrepreneurial sectors, the social partners, and there we're going to be looking at the digital transition, environmental transition, and that is going to be a specific moment in time, and we have to make the most of it to set out very specific priorities and objectives for the recovery plans, and we have to provide some kind of horizon, some prospects for our young generations and our young people, so that they don't see their dreams shattered. The young people represent a force of innovation and energy, and we should not lose sight of the young people. So all of the decisions that we are going to be taking have to take account of the future generations. We want a fairer, a juster, a greener Europe, and this is the ambition that I wanted to try and get across to all of you this afternoon in addressing the European Parliament and the national parliaments. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to set this out.
Thank you very much, President Charles Michel, for your comments and your invitation to us. And now I'll give the floor to President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. She's connected with us, I believe. There you are. So, President, you have the floor.
Grazie, Presidente. President Ferro Rodrigues, honourable members of the European Parliament and of the national parliaments. Your presence today testifies a very simple fact. Our recovery plan, Next Generation EU, belongs to all Europeans. We crafted it here in Brussels with one objective in mind. All European countries should have the resources to lift their people out of this crisis, and particularly those countries that have been hit the hardest. All Europeans must be given a chance to recover from the corona crisis. And this is why Europe will raise 750 billion euros and distribute these resources to all member states. It is kind of a helping hand from Europe to all Europeans, and I'm glad that recently the European Parliament has approved our Recovery and Resilience Facility by an overwhelming majority. Over 80% of the House has supported our proposal. Today, Europe is united in the fight against COVID, but this shows we remain united in recovery. Now, it is up to every country in our union to make good use of this opportunity made in Europe. 7 European countries, including Portugal, have already ratified the own resources decision. That is how we will fund Next Generation EU. And I encourage all of you to do the same as a matter of urgency, because only with the ratified own resources decision can we put the fuel in the recovery. And the people of Europe cannot wait. Our collective future is now entirely in your hands, the hands of the parliaments in Europe. The next step will be to bring Next Generation EU into life in each of your countries. Europe is providing every member state with a unique opportunity to kind of restart its economy. It's up to you to seize this opportunity. And you've just heard from Antonio Guterres, the recovery is not about turning the clocks back to a year ago. This is the time to build forward better, as he said. And with Next Generation EU, we can shape a better economy for Europe. Of course, our most urgent task is to help healthy businesses pull through the crisis and create new jobs. But as we do so, we should also aim at making Europe greener, more digital, and more inclusive. And today, I would like to give you 3 examples of what Next Generation EU can do in your countries. First, Next Generation EU can cut our CO2 emissions while creating jobs already in the short term. And let me show you how with a very basic example. The construction sector was hit very hard by the lockdowns, and it has not fully recovered yet. Next Generation EU can help fixing this. Over half of residential buildings in Europe are more than 50 years old. Millions of Europeans are used to drafty windows and old boilers. This isn't just uncomfortable in cold times, it is a massive waste of energy. With Next Generation EU, we would like to launch a renovation wave of residential buildings all across Europe. And this will cut our emissions, make our homes more comfortable, and breathe new life in the construction sector. Is this the right solution for your country or your region? Only you can tell us. You know best what kind of green investment your country needs most, be it from energy infrastructure and hydrogen valleys to the restoration perhaps of forests and biodiversity. So national recovery plans represent the opportunity to make your country greener while lifting up the economy. The second example. Next Generation EU can and should start off a digital decade for Europe. This is, of course, about building the infrastructure our businesses are longing for, from 5G and 6G to safe data spaces. But this is also, and I would say crucially, about our most important asset, and that is people. During the pandemic, businesses of all kinds have digitalized their operations like never before. Some simply started, for example, selling their products online. Many others invested in new software, on new applications on artificial intelligence. Not all workers and businesses are keeping pace with such rapid innovation. Next Generation EU has something for them too. It can finance digital education for workers who see their workplace changing before their eyes. For those who've lost their jobs and need to learn new skills, for example, Next Generation is there too. But also for teachers or other public sector workers, for example. It can help business owners who are not digital natives to find the digital solutions they need in a changing world. And here again, every European country has specific needs, from networks to e-government, from innovation hubs to perhaps digitalizing your schools. This is the moment for each member state to chart its own path into Europe's digital decade. And last but not least, we must make sure that all Europeans get a fair chance to move out of the crisis. Some have described the pandemic as the great equalizer. This is so untrue. And the other speakers mentioned it. Women lost their jobs more easily than men. Young people looking for their first job were often discouraged. The coming months will be crucial to address these rising inequalities and build a fairer economy for the future. And since the start of the pandemic, Europe has already taken action. We reinforced, for example, the youth guarantee, so that all Europeans under the age of 30 who come out of education or lose their job can get a new opportunity within 4 months. Or we launched a pact for skills to give workers the skills they need in an evolving labor market. And more proposals will come in early March, when we will present our action plan to implement the European Pillar of Social Rights ahead of the Social Summit in Porto. And again, Next Generation EU will bring fresh resources to invest in skills, in equal opportunities for women and for the younger generations. This is the moment to bring the social dimension into the recovery. Well, these are the goals we have agreed together with the 27 governments and the European Parliament: a green recovery, a digital recovery, a fair recovery for all. This is the only path towards a resilient recovery, a recovery that can stand the test of time. And in the coming months, every country will have to come up with the best projects and reforms to make the most out of Next Generation EU. We encourage national parliaments to contribute to this process. The resources will come from Europe, but the ideas must come from every country. We need your scrutiny and your commitment to turn European investment into local growth. And the European Parliament will be involved every step of the way. Every national plan will be transmitted to the European Parliament. The Commission will listen to your views in regular dialogues, and we will take them into account in assessing the plans. It's a matter of transparency, because Next Generation EU belongs to all Europeans. And I know it may sound strange to talk about recovery as the pandemic still rages on. These are difficult weeks in Portugal and in other places across our continent. Today, we are not yet where we would like to be in combating the virus. We have to find rapid responses, for example, to the rising threat of variants. And this is the reason why the Commission launched the HERA incubator last week. That is a public-private cooperation of science, the health sector, authorities like the EMA, and industry, to screen for variants, if necessary to adapt the vaccines, then to steer clinical trials in Europe, and most important, to manufacture existing and new vaccines at scale, mass manufacturing. I have no doubt that Europe will recover. All countries, big and small, at the four corners of our continent, will recover from this health crisis together. And when all 27 will have ratified the own resources decision, kind of new oxygen will flow into our economy. Next Generation EU is for all of Europe, and all of Europe will share in its success. In every capital, in every government and parliament across our continent. In other words, Europe needs all of you, all of us. Europe will be what we want it to be. So let's all go to work. Thank you for listening to me, and long live Europe.
Grazie, Presidente von der Leyen.
Thank you very much, President von der Leyen. I will now give the floor to Christine Lagarde, President of the European Central Bank. You have the floor.
Grazie mille, Presidente. President Sassoli, President Rodriguez, President Michel, President von der Leyen, Secretary General Guterres, Managing Director Giorgiova, honourable members of European Parliament and national parliaments, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank you warmly for inviting me to speak to you today. It's a privilege to be able to talk to the citizens' representative at the heart of European democracy. Events like this one allows us to consider national debates in discussions about our common challenges as Europeans. For all of us, the past year of the pandemic has been an extraordinary challenge. And at all levels, the public policy response has been truly impressive. National responses have spearheaded the policy effort, with fiscal measures amounting to, on average, 4.5% of euro area GDP. Yet the response to this crisis stands out from previous ones in that the level of policy alignment achieved has been truly unprecedented. The strength of Europe's crisis response has crucially depended on the strength of national and European responses across all areas: monetary, fiscal, supervisory, and regulatory. But the pandemic is not over yet. Policy alignment that I've just described will continue to be imperative for what lies ahead. So what I would like to do briefly, because I know that there is a long list of very eminent speakers before me, and you probably have had a lot of speeches so far, but I'd like to look at just ways in which our policies can keep reinforcing each other in addressing two common challenges. From all corners of Europe, we're facing it. One, shielding the economy, and two, subsequently transforming the economy. Let's look at the shielding first. While people are drawing hope from the start of vaccination campaigns, the first challenge, shielding, calls for us to continue to bridge the gap until widespread immunity is achieved. So vaccination, vaccination, vaccination. Across Europe, people are still grappling with the economic and social consequences of the pandemic. And it is still highly uncertain how the next stages of the pandemic will unfold, as President von der Leyen just indicated. In this context, our pandemic emergency purchase program has been tailored to the pandemic, helping to stabilize markets and ease our policy stance to support the recovery. It will continue to be a crucial tool. The PEP, that's how we call it, the PEP envelope of 1,850 billion euros gives us considerable firepower and flexibility in conducting purchases. Moreover, our targeted longer-term refinancing operations, that we call TLTROs, will remain an attractive source of funding for banks, supporting the flow of credit to households and to firms. SMEs tend to benefit disproportionately from abundant and cheap credit, and smaller firms have been able to borrow at the lowest rates ever recorded. The ECB will continue to support all sectors of the economy by preserving favourable financing over the pandemic period, as it has done ever since the start of the crisis. We will continue doing it. This commitment implies looking at indicators along the whole transmission chain of our monetary policy, from risk-free rates to governments, borrowing costs, to capital markets, to bank lending for firms and bank lending to households. Within the broad-based set of indicators that we monitor to assess whether financing conditions are in fact still favourable, risk-free OIS rates and sovereign yields are particularly important because they are good early indicators of what happens at downstream stages of monetary policy transmission, since banks use those yields as a reference when setting the price of their loans to households and to firms. Accordingly, the ECB is closely monitoring the evolution of longer-term nominal bond yields. The overall policy mix, however, remains essential. While the pandemic persists and lockdowns and heightened uncertainty continue, firms and households will only be able to take full advantage of those favourable financing conditions if national policy measures are deployed to help monetary policy unfold its full potential. By continuing to take the lead in protecting the firms and sectors most exposed to the crisis, fiscal policy can help brighten economic prospects for firms and households, thereby strengthening monetary policy transmission. Let me give you an example. The ECB's Consumer Expectations Survey demonstrates it. People who consider government support to be more adequate display less precautionary behaviour, and those people are in turn more likely to respond to favourable financing conditions and increase their consumption. In the euro area, the budget balance is expected to be minus 6.1% of GDP in 2021. With monetary and fiscal policies working in tandem, we hope that we finally cross the bridge and reach the other side of the pandemic on solid ground. So let's turn to the transforming of the economy, because that challenge will arise as the economy gradually reopens, and it will be quite a different one. It won't be about returning to the pre-pandemic status quo. It will be about bringing the economy rapidly back to potential while using the thrust of the recovery to transform our economies. And the focus will then be on reducing the damage caused by the pandemic, such as permanent job reductions, which 1 in 5 firms are considering, fixing those crushed dreams that young people had before the pandemic. At the same time, it will be crucial to harness the potential offered by the pandemic, which has spurred the multi-year leap in digital progress and has brought a new focus on sustainability. Digital and green technologies present massive possibilities for more vibrant, inclusive and sustainable growth. In the energy sector alone, scaling up green investment to the necessary levels could create an estimated 1.1 million jobs across Europe by 2030. Europe is leading the way in addressing this double policy challenge. You just heard it. Its next generation EU that I call NGU, this recovery package is designed to support demand today and generate growth potential tomorrow through investment and through reforms. And indeed, NGUs is expected to provide on average around 1% of GDP in grants and loans per year over the next 3 years, while committing 37% of funds to green investment and 20% to digital, as you just heard from the President of the Commission. Next to EU policies, national policy action will have to play a vital enabling role in smoothing the transition and promoting change. First, by ensuring that NGU funds can be fully operational when the decisions on own resources are ratified in all member states, which in many cases involves national parliaments. Second, by creating the right economic environment to boost the impact of NGU. And that means improving the quality of government spending and ensuring that NGU is firmly rooted in sound structural policies conceived and implemented at the national level. If used for productive public investment, NGU funds could increase real output in the euro area by around 1.5% of GDP over the medium term. So these must be priority areas if we are to reform, modernize, and come out of this crisis on the other side of the bridge with renewed vigor. So let me conclude by emphasizing that all of us, across all policy levels, must pull together to meet our shared challenges and ensure that Europe can emerge stronger from the pandemic. Today is the 22nd of February. It is the birthday of Lord Robert Baden-Powell, the pioneer of Scouting. The Scouts' motto, toujours prêt, be prepared, is apt for us too. For Europe to be prepared and bring about positive change in 2021 and beyond, national and European decision makers need to uphold our team effort. We can be ready together. The ECB will continue to play its part, I can assure you. Thank you.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. We've heard some very important contributions about the instruments that have already been enacted and the responsibilities and challenges it faces in the near future. As President Lagarde told us, we need to be prepared. And the best way to be prepared is to not stop. As you'll have heard from our speakers this afternoon, the recovery is an uncertain one, and it will be an unequal one. It will more profoundly affect people's lives than we ever could have thought. So we cannot stop our efforts. We have to ensure that this year of lessons learnt from COVID could be the basis for a profound transformation of our economy, and certainly not some kind of turning back the clock. I'd like to thank all of the presidents of the institutions for their contributions. We have been able to mobilize and even invent instruments. We haven't stopped, but now we need more inventions and more imagination. While we're concluding this first panel, I'll give the floor to President Ferro Rodrigues, and then I'll invite the Vice President of the European Parliament, Dita Charantsova, to get ready to chair the second panel, which will be on the preparation of national recovery and resilience plans as state of play.